I'm happy to be a member of the club. I'm a member of the club because I made a new friend a couple of years ago, well, more than a couple of years ago, but in the last couple of years, Paul has shared my interest in the International Philatelic exhibitions. And as Paul said, I went to the one when I was 11. And then when I was 71, I was actually the vice president of operations for the 2016 show. And since then, I've been helping Paul accumulate a lot of material that I've been helping. And I just feel very close to him because he understands a lot of the things that were of interest to me. We share the same interests. So tonight, we are going to talk about Nassau Street, the stamp collector's paradise. I have some photographs, I have some ephemera, I have postal history presentation material. And for those of you who are not sure what ephemera is, it comes from the term ephemeral, something that is short in time and not supposed to last. And ephemera in the hobby refers to paper goods and other items that were issued for the moment, but were not necessarily supposed to be around 50, 60, or 70 years later. And the other thing I should tell you is that when I was 11, 12, and 13, my dad took me to Gimbel's and to Bipex when I was 11. When I was 12 and 13, I was able to take the train from Brooklyn as a 12-year-old with my friend Lenny by ourselves to go to Nassau Street every Saturday morning. And so I've always been very interested in this. And in a little while, I'll tell you how I got more interested. So what you have to know is that if you're familiar with the lower tip of Manhattan, Nassau Street is 7 or 8 blocks long, but only 3 or 4 blocks of the 7 or 8 were ever in the stamp center. 3.5 to 4 blocks were in the stamp center. The famous intersection of Wall and Nassau had nothing to do with the stamps. That was 3 or 4 blocks away. And 27 to 39 was also in the south. We start at 53 and go up to 165 to talk about the stamp center. And there it shows on the map the top 4 blocks that I'm talking about. I was going to point to that. I don't have a pointer. And it's right at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge. When Nassau Street first opened in the 1800s, there was no Brooklyn Bridge, but now the ramps to the Brooklyn Bridge practically dump out on the northern tip of Nassau Street. The other thing is interesting, and I've not shown this material since 2012. And in 2012, someone looked at this postcard and said, "Oh my God, Zulac." And that was the last thing I saw on this postcard. I didn't see Zulac. I saw that tall building, which is 116 Nassau, and we'll talk a lot about that. I saw all the retail stores. Zulac, it turns out, was a Dr. Zulac, who had some kind of nefarious wild medicine that he bottled in little bottles. And the guy at the Collectors Club who saw the card told me, "I collect the little bottles of medicine, these little perfume and medicine bottles from the 19th century." So only to say that every hobby leads to another hobby. And that's always very interesting that Zulac was a doctor's name and had that kind of medicine to it. The name Nassau Street in the hobby was immortalized by the late, great Herman Hurst Jr., nicknamed Pat Hurst, in his best-selling book, Nassau Street, which went through 7 printings. And at one point, I still have all 7 printings. I'll tell you more about that later. But I want you to look at the red book. You'll notice that all of them are hardcover, except the red book, which is softcover. And that's the book that Linz bought from Pat in 1987. Michael Lawrence and Linz and Amos bought the full rights to the book in 1987. And in 1988, published that little red book. And so this cover to me in Post Office Box 12, Boys Town, Nebraska, which was my address for 10 years, is what titillated me to start thinking about Nassau Street. And there's an interesting thing that you have to know about Nassau Street. It's subtitled A Quarter Century of Stamp Dealing by Pat, and it's signed Philatelically yours, Herman Hurst Jr. Now, one day, I was at the American Philatelic Research Library looking in their used books for $5 and $10. And I found a copy of Nassau Street that had no inscription. And I yelled out, even though it was a library, I said, "Oh my God, I just found a $10,000 book. It doesn't have Pat Hurst's signature." He went through life signing every single copy of every one of his 7 books. And so to find one without the inscription was kind of interesting. Here's my favorite one that's still in my collection. Unfortunately, even though I got to know Pat, and I'll talk about that in a minute, I never got to see this book until after he passed. So I have no idea who that is. But he talked a lot about dealers chiseling from one another. And so somebody sold that book back to the APRL, and I paid $10 for it in Belfast. And my parents, this picture was taken in 1984 at the Omaha Stamp Show, the 50th anniversary, of which I was the chair in Omaha, Nebraska. That's Pat Hurst and Ida Hurst in 1984. My parents moved to Boca Raton in 1979. And my dad visited in 1980, said, "Let's go visit Pat Hurst." I never in my wildest dreams thought I would do that. Make a long story short, we became lifelong friends till his death from 1980 till he passed in 1998. Pat Hurst was a dealer on Nassau Street. This is the quintessential starting cover because he started his Nassau Street business in 1935. And while he was still a runner boy for Leventhal Bonds. And if you read the book, you'll hear all about his relationship with Mr. Leventhal. He made 10 of these 5th anniversary stock market crash covers before he ever entered into the business. And he was very good with patriotic covers all through his time on Nassau Street. He printed up over a dozen different patriotics and collars. And what you should know about patriotics and collars, as I wanted you to know that this is a fun presentation. There is also an academic side to everything that I'm talking about. And the academic side here is that both Jacques Minkus and George Lind were leaders from 1940 to after World War II of printing World War II patriotics. There have been books and articles and exhibits built, and these were Pat's contributions too. There were a lot of other covers. He was a guest speaker often. You'll notice that that's not the United States stamp that posted speaker invitation. He was very popular in Shrub Oak, New York. In the first year that they moved there and left Nassau Street in 1946, he received 100,000 letters. It upgraded the post office from 4th class to 2nd class post office in 1 year because of the mail that Herman Hurst Jr. was getting. And even though his name is not on there, he obviously got it delivered. Another academic side to this story is the publication Hearst Outbursts. Started publishing them in 1939 and did them until 1973, 140 copies. And all you had to do to get Hearst Outbursts was to send them 6 SASEs at the same time. Mr. Finlay sent him 6 SASEs, and Pat sent him 6 issues of the Outbursts. And they were all stamped with the Shrub Oak local post. That's Alfie, the dog, that carried the mail across the street from the Hearst residence to the post office. And the 140 issues contain stuff to this day that nobody has reprinted anywhere. It's a bevy, a plethora of information about the hobby and specific stamps. It's just amazing. And the whole run is available in Belfont. The first 10 issues are very hard. Some of them were just typed and Xerox, not Xerox, it wasn't a Xerox, carbon paper. But starting from number 11 on, one can assemble a collection for a couple $100 or Xerox the whole APRL collection. Another thing that happened is when Pat moved to Boca Raton, he took Post Office Box 1583, and covers from 1978 till his death don't have his name on it, as do the covers I showed you just now. But as much as I love Pat and got to know him for almost 20 years, Pat was the chiseler of the post office. He loved using skips. And if you look at this cover carefully, which you can't, you just have to trust me, both of these were glued down skips that he used for his mail. He just had some kind of perverse joy out of using skips. So let's move on to some other people and why we mention them on Nassau Street. Nassau Street is rich and a rich source of philatelic knowledge. If you collect or are interested in stamped envelopes, you'll notice that this is the Thorpe Bartels column. The Thorpe Bartels catalog, which to this day is the standard catalog for United States stamp postal stationery. And produced by a Mr. Thorpe, whose name was Prescott Holden Thorpe. And this is an ephemera that I have passed on to, piece of ephemera that I passed on to Paul. It's the catalog of all the stamped envelopes on exhibit at the 1947 show. For those of you who are paying attention, the shows were often in the 6th year, but in 1947, they were in the 7th year to celebrate the 100th anniversary of stamps. And so Prescott Holden Thorpe lived in New Jersey. J. Murray Bartels lived in New York and was a dealer in Nassau Street, as you can see at 99 Nassau Street. There are a number of things about J. Murray that you have to know. Most interesting is that he was a direct descendant of George Washington's grandfather, Lawrence Washington. And he became a stamp dealer in Virginia in 1892. He moved to Washington in 1897 when he purchased a stamp firm there, and then to Boston in 1901. And finally, Nassau Street gets him in 1911. He was considered an expert on envelopes, and his catalog, as I said, is still the basic catalog today. Note that the corner card says J.M. Bartels, the blue one, 99 Nassau Street. The bottom was J.M. Bartels postage stamps on envelopes. Took him a while to realize that envelopes are not exactly postage stamps, and he was trying to give them a good name in the hobby and in the world. Another interesting thing about these covers, I don't want to sell any of these covers. They all sell themselves. Like this stunning registry cover, 10-cent registry cover, and with 12 cents postage. It's a beautiful use of the first airmail stamp, but everybody would say, oh, it's not kosher because it was franked by a stamp dealer. And I'm going to show you covers over the next half hour. I'm going to keep complaining to you that they should be regular, accepted commercial postal history covers. Stamp dealers on Nassau Street moved around a lot. You could see both of these envelopes have pasted over addresses. And Murray moved from 99 to 116, but both envelopes were pasted over because these guys were moving a lot. The Nassau Street book has some hysterical stories of moving before the rent was due because they couldn't pay their rent and they kept moving around. Some of them the landlords got a hold of and wouldn't rent to because they had absconded with so many places. And here are a couple of others where he was on John Street. Another little minor story is that John intersects Nassau Street at number 65. And so he was right around the corner. These are legitimate Nassau Street covers. Nassau Street, ladies and gentlemen, is not only a literal idea, it's a conceptual idea. It's the idea that there was a stamp center in New York City for more than 60 or 70 years that was beyond reach of any city or country in the world in terms of stamp collectors.
Oh, okay.
Murray was also an activist. Here's a piece of article from McKeel's in which he's complaining about the fact that the Post Office Department has on numerous occasions added dignity and importance to such occasions by the careful preparation of artistic work on stamps. And now all of a sudden, what the hell happened? He writes, the policy apparently by your department during recent months leads us to conclude that it is no longer deemed necessary to supply a separate design, but all that would be required is an overprint. And Murray was one of the leaders in the country to get the DOD to stop overprinting stamps using the excuse that they had no time. Is that coming from here, or you hear a woman talking now? No, okay. This is a famous photo from a publication called the Philatelic Gazette. Brandy Neal for years ran this photo in his magazine, the ASDA magazine, saying, who are these gangsters? And this was actually the committee of the first international exhibition held in 1913. And what you want to see is that Murray was very influential in the 1913 show and the 1926 show, and was very much responsible for making the 1913-1926 show possible. So now we want to read the next dealer card. This is a business card from Berger and Company. And what you have to know is that Berger Company were two guys. They were Gus and Arthur, his brother. And they were at 90 and 53 Nassau Street, back and forth for over 70 years. They moved in 1886, and they stayed till 1950s. Their premises were covered with paper and trash and rarities, including many discoveries made by the brothers themselves when they went bicycling in foreign countries and the South, looking for Confederate covers and old letters from the Confederacy. The building that housed the Bergers at 53 was 5 stories high, and it had no elevator, and the restrooms were torrid. Despite all the clutter about them in these two places, the Berger brothers had a whole routine in which they could find almost anything in their stock when someone asked. So it is said that when a stamp collector came in and said, I'd like a copy of US 1851 Scott number 11, Arthur would be at the counter, Gus would be in the back. And Arthur showed them a copy of number 11, which was great. He said, this is perfect. And Arthur yells back to Gus, what should we charge this guy for the 11? And Gus would say, $20. And then Arthur would tell the collector in earshot all the while, the collector heard this, just what I was thinking, this will be $40. They were nicknamed the Burglar Brothers because they were the cheapest guys on the block, and they would take horrific prices. There was a club of dealers on Nassau Street that tried to pay them back by getting stamps from them very cheap and reselling them very high. It was called the Fox Club, and they were to outfox us and Arthur Berger. One of my favorite covers is this Berger and Company self-addressed stamp envelope, which is the size of a business card. And I just love it because you think about mail handling today, that actually traveled through the mail. And it was absolutely amazing that it could get through. Another thing that's interesting about Nassau Street, needless to say, and this ties back to what I was talking about before, the Columbians were used and around for postage until the 1920s. These are both covers from the 19-teens and 1920s using 3-cent Columbians. And it was remarkable. At that time, you could buy 100 $2 Columbians for $188 into the 20s. They were selling them as discount postage. So that's something else to know, that discount postage has been around all the time. And here's just more. I mean, if you're a specialist on top of the Washington and Franklin's, or you're a specialist on the 4th Bureau on the bottom, or Washington and Franklin both, or the Columbian envelope, or whatever, these two covers fit into like 10 collections. But they're usually banned because they're stamp collector dealer stamp dealer corner cards. And my position, and I've written about it for 25 years, is these are commercial covers of the guys doing business. This is nothing more than a man doing business to his customers in Florida and Pennsylvania. So we come back to that postcard that I showed you earlier with Zulak. And there's the 116 Nassau Street. And it was called the Levi P. Morton Building. And it was called the Stamp Center Building. And it was a dramatic high-rise at 12 stories. Who knows who Levi P. Morton was? I can't ask because we're not doing it that way. So I'll tell you that Levi P. Morton was the 22nd Vice President of the United States from 1889 to 1893. He was also governor of New York, and he was Benjamin Harrison's vice president. I challenge you tomorrow morning when you feel like searching the internet to go find any reference on the entire internet to the Levi P. Morton Building, which became the Stamp Center Building, which is still, this is the way it looked like when I was a kid. You walked up to the Stamp Center Building, 12 stories of stamps on the street. That guy is touching glass where the stamps were under. They weren't taken out at night. It was a city where you could leave stamps in showcases overnight. And now this is what's left of the building. It's totally washed, totally cleaned, and it's just a regular office building. But what's very sad is poor old Levi P. Morton doesn't have his name on a building anymore. I don't know if we want to take up his cause or not. I included this John A. Fox cover because of a number of articles have been written which noted that he was not a Nassau Street stamp dealer. And the point is he was on Nassau Street for less than a year. So his covers are harder to find. He was in Long Island all of his career. If you're not familiar with the name, I would recommend, here's another academic suggestion. John A. Fox was one of the biggest frauds and thieves in the entire stamp market in history. He fraudulently developed hundreds and hundreds of valuable 19th century covers, put them into his auction, and was subsequently arrested, thrown out of ASDA. But the story is absolutely wonderful in terms of murder, not murder, there was no murder to think of, intrigue and mystery. This is a cover from Hal Ozanian, who was an Egyptian dealer on Nassau Street in 116. Apparently, I don't know this for sure because I don't remember what's on the back of the cover, but the date on the back of the cover shows that it was on while he was a brand new part-time dealer on Nassau Street, and Hurst befriended him and helped him grow into a full-time dealer, and they were lifelong friends until he passed away. And again, when do you see Farley's Follies as postage? What can you do to say were Farley's Follies ever used for postage? Here's a 24-cent registry utilizing a block of 4 6-cent Farley Follies. And that's another sub-story. I hope there's no time to explain what Farley Follies are, but I hope many of you are familiar with them. So 116 Nassau Street had 12 stories. At one time, over 45 dealers. Just think about the idea of 45 dealers being in one building, and then over 3 blocks on 2- and 3-story office buildings and storefronts, another 100 dealers. That there were as many as 150 at one time. Now there's the real academic paper, is how the hobby was able to sustain 150 dealers for about 25, 30 or 40 years at its zenith. I wanted to make a point that I haven't shown this collection since 2012. I showed it in 20 frames at the Collectors Club in 2012. That's 320 pages. And there at the Collectors Club that night, was my friend Stephen Velasco, of now blessed memory. Steve Velasco has authored many books and is an expert in certain United States stamps. But that night, Steve Velasco told me, February 2012, that we're going to get together because he had all of Nassau Street to 1900, and I started Nassau Street in 1901. And I only mention that because he passed away 5 months later, and we never got to do it. But there is a history of Nassau Street that goes from about 1900 that we could get into someday, that he was an expert on. And then from 1901 to about 1910, things built up. And the heyday started in the 1915s, 19 teens, and the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. That was 40 years with the heyday. And so you had people all throughout 116, a guy named Ralph Orton, with an early use of zip code, not zip code, zone, postal zone 7. It's now 10038, but it started off as 10007. And George B. Sloan was a favorite of my dealer because my dad gave me a subscription to Stamps Magazine. And he was a weekly writer in Stamps Magazine. And he wrote on over 1,000 articles in the magazine. And they were all published in a book called Sloan's Column, which is still available from the United States Stamp Society. He was an expert on United States stamps of all kinds, as you could see by reading Sloan's Column. So and then there was this Holman Crosser firm, which was one of the older firms. This is a 1930 cover. They lasted till the 1950s. It's a long time ago, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. But at one point, when Randy Neal was still editing American Stamp Dealer, he was possessed by coming up with a directory of every single Nassau Street stamp dealer. And by the time he stopped, we weren't finished. He had named about 130 of them. But there were well more of them because some of them lasted only weeks. And so you have R.W. Harris, Bedroom. They lasted a long time. But we cannot find anything about the Menorah Company at 116 Nassau Street except its unused envelope. And I'm guessing after all these years of trying to research it, maybe somebody printed up the envelopes to do business but never opened the shop. We can't find an envelope like that. So another very famous dealer of Nassau Street was Lee Gilbert. But I brought you here to show you his auction catalogs. All these guys had auctions. I want you to be aware that another thing you might want to branch out into are auction catalogs through to the 1950s. They were all 5x7. These are 5x7 auction catalogs without pictures and suddenly black and white pictures. You know, it was illegal to print even black and white stamps till 1939. So until 1939, there were no pictures. And then 1939 to the 40s, there were black and white stamps. And a little piece of trivia, if you're on Jeopardy, and the category is colored auction catalogs. When was the first colored auction catalog? It was in 1980, believe it or not. Charles Shreve and Steve Ivey, the company, printed the very first stamp catalog, all in color. But Lee Gilbert was one of the famous auctioneers and experts in United States stamps. We're running okay, so I would just like to read a very quick chapter from the book. And this is Pat Hurst walking into Lee Gilbert's office. And he says, Pat says, and Lee Gilbert says to him, what do you have that's cheap, Pat? And Pat says, I have a set of Colombians at face. And I answered, showing him the page with a complete set for the quite common stamp that I had just ruined. He had just fooled around trying to take the 1 cent off the page and it crumbled. And then Lee Gilbert walks in and says, what do you got? So he's trying to sell him the one page. And Lee Gilbert says, face value? He eagerly asked. And Pat says, yes, that's true, but no returns, no complaints, no refunds. He agreed and we added up the face value. We paid for them. I don't know what's wrong with him, Pat, but I can't possibly lose. I suggested before he came into the conclusion that he can't lose, you take the 2-cent Colombian, you put it in water with tweezers and take it from the page. And it did that, and it was pulverized. So the next day, when he came back to Pat, he said, "Do you have any more of those Colombians?" And Pat said, "What are you talking about? They're not worth anything." And he said, Pat said, "How did you get them off the page?" He said, "I didn't get them off the page. I found a customer who bought them from me at twice space and put them in his album. And a matter of fact, he covered the entire page with shellac, and now they'll never come off." And so that's why I say we're talking about fun tonight, because it's a fun story. But those are the kinds of stories that are in the book between these dealers who are always having a lot of fun with each other. Then there's the Economist Stamp Company, which if you are all interested in starting a collection or browsing through dealer boxes for stamp dealer companies, this is one of the most plentiful corner card in the hobby. The Economist Stamp Company, was owned by a guy named Edward Stern, who lived from 1880 to 1953. And it was another important stamp company on Nassau Street. Stern was considered an expert and was offered many valuable collections, and was also an advisor to the 1926 show, and was an agent for people like Saul Newberry in Chicago, and was very trusted in the hobby. Edward Stern at the Economist Stamp Company. Again, from everything I know about covers, and I don't know a lot, if you look at the top cover and you found it in a dealer box with those two stamps on it and those two stamps on it, would be $75 to $100. Registry, forwarded. I mean, how exciting more do you get? Registry, forwarded, not dated on the front like it's supposed to be. And yet, most judges, unfortunately, would say, well, those stamps are on there because, look, they're straight edges. And the dealer didn't know what to do with straight edges. So he used them on postage. Same thing down below. Pat Hurst wrote a book chapter in which he said his theory is buy straight edges, because someday, since most of them are being used for postage, they will be more valuable than four-side perforated stamps. Whenever he gave a talk, he said that to people. Buy straight edges. These covers from Ed Stern's company show that. And again, here are economists through the ages at 70 and 87, 1947, 1924, and 1918. 1924 cover has the 1 cent and the 5 cent on it. The other thing about collecting stamp dealer covers is that registered covers always had to be sealed. You know, to this day, when you mail a registered cover, they stamp the back, so if the seal is broken, you could see it was broken. A lot of the dealers used hot wax with their own imprimatur as proof to seal it. Then the last real company I want to tell you about is the Nassau Stamp Company, founded by two brothers, Clayman and Clayman. John Clayman and his brother Jacob. John and Jacob Clayman. What's interesting about this cover is that F.W. Hunter, and this is a specialty cover. I tried not to do too many specialty stories because this could be totally boring to the actual viewer. Hunter formed the Nassau Stamp Company in 1895, and he hired one employee as a secretary and assistant, and that was John A. Clayman. 4 years later, Clayman acquired the capital stock of the company, and in 1900 brought his brother Jacob into it. So John and Jacob eventually became the proprietors of the Nassau Stamp Company. And in the 4 years that Fred Hunter was there, it was a tiny business. It was Clayman and Clayman that built up the business. Another specialty cover, again, this is a whole separate topic. Paul would be particularly interested in this, is John A. Clayman was the volunteer secretary of the Association of Stamp Exhibitions, which was created in 1913 to put on the every 10-year international. So they put on the 1913 show, 1926, 1936, 1947. And John Clayman was secretary for like 30 years. It's a very hard cover to find as a Nassau Street cover, so I won't dwell on it. But I do want to tell you a little IPEX story. The International Association for Stamp Exhibitions collapsed in 1955. In 1955, 1 year before FIPEX, because they said the unions in New York were driving them to drink. They couldn't manage putting on the 1956 show anymore. And so a group of private collectors and dealers came together and put it on. But again, when you have a hobby such as, or a theme such as Nassau Street, there are all sorts of subtopics. All the corner cards that are not exactly Nassau Street stamp corner cards. Here's an interesting cover with scribbling on the side. I showed it straight way up. It says Orangeburg coils. Here's the Claymans sending Eugene Klein Orangeburg coils and him writing about them on the cover. And then the Grinnell missionaries are about Jacob Clayman went to court because he spent $65,000 buying stamps that were bogus. And he went to court and he won his $65,000 back. What's interesting about the case, and this is another academic side story, we talked a whole hour about the Grinnell missionaries, and I'm spending 30 seconds telling you that John Clayman was a major player in it. But this brochure, which you're looking at, is available free if you write to Don Sunman at Mystic Stamp Company. It's a brochure about the rediscovery and the redealing of the Grinnell missionaries in the 21st century. But Clayman was the one that dealt with it in the 1920s. And he won, according to this New York Times article, his money back. This is a catalog of Max Ullman's, one of the handsomest guys on Nassau Street. Max was an amazing guy. He was the founder of the American Stamp Dealer Association, and he was FDR's private or personal stamp dealer. So here you have the Max Ullman, and he puts ASDA at the bottom there in parentheses, even though this was 25 years after he founded the ASDA. He was very proud that he was the one who created it. And he was at 116 Nassau. But his claim to fame was FDR was his customer. And you could see all these high bids that FDR made. $3, $4, $3 sent to the governor's mansion in Albany. And then Max was very proud of his relationship with FDR. And one day he was invited to the White House. And this story talks about his disappointment. And I copied this text for you. Promptly at 4 p.m., I was at the east gate of the White House, and I lifted the latch. Actually, that's one of my favorite lines in the whole hobby. You walk up to the White House and you lift the latch. Soon an attendant came to the gate. Is this Mr. Ullman? He asked. And he said yes. And he said, the president's expecting you. And he let Max in, but he let him in with a whole bunch of other people, and it was not a private meeting, but he still loved the meeting. And this is Max's publication. I want to suggest that the publications like Pat Hurst that I showed you, and the other one, the Gazette, and this one are rich sources of stories that have never been published anywhere else. And this is a list of the past president of the ASDA. You can see that Max Ullman was the founding president. John Clayman was there. Gene Klein was there. John Clayman again. Murray Bartels, Hugh Clark, J.J. Clayman, Sidney Barrett, some of the guys that made it happen. To be sure, there were other people allowed on Nassau Street, such as Goldman Sachs down at 31. You'll never find a stamp dealer below 53. The first 3.5 to 4 blocks were regular, real life people, and the people from 53 on to 164 was paradise for stamp collectors. Well, and Goldman Sachs was there for many, many years. And we said that Nassau Street was a street of dreams, and the dreams began falling apart. This is a 1969 press photo, a glossy photo, in which it was the first day ever a street in New York was closed for a pedestrian mall. And you could see this is John Lindsay, the mayor that made it possible. But on both sides of the street, there are more non-stamp shops than stamp shops. If this were 10 years earlier in 59, almost every one of those stamp fronts would have been, or storefronts would have been a stamp store. What's most interesting about Nassau Street is at the northern tip of Nassau Street is a statue of Ben Franklin that was put up over 150 years ago. On the left, you see Ben on the statue and Nassau Street behind him. He's looking away because I guess he didn't know when he was around that Nassau, his being first postmaster would be so important. And I just love today's photo, which has the no standing, no parking sign, the lift snowblade plow. But what you do see is the corner building is still there from 1870 and the one on the right. But then you see the skyscrapers that have replaced the Nassau Street stores. So as we bid farewell to the stamp collector's paradise, we asked, who was the last dealer to leave Nassau Street and in what year? It was the Subway Stamp Shop, and they are very much still alive. They left in 1994. The Subway Stamp Shop, as you may know, was owned by Virginia and Mel Goldberg for all these years. And Mel passed away in 2003, but it was there for 10 years of relocating the shop to Altoona, Pennsylvania. And in very big tribute to my friends Mel and Virginia, the fact that they stayed longer. In 1994, they were the last ones for about 10 years. The last people left before that around the 1980s. I offer you this wonderful cover, which tells me a great story about the hobby. You could see it was sent to me recently by Subway Stamp Shop in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And the two things I love about it the most is it's franked with 10-cent famous Americans, which were never canceled. And one can only imagine, hopefully they were all hinged on the back, but that just shows you how much they were. And they were never canceled. So that's the dilemma of people collecting postal history, how precious this would have been if it were a canceled cover. So I want to thank you for your time and attention. I want to tell you that learning never ends. It's my favorite stamp. I use it a lot. And that while we all have to be supportive of the Lancaster Club, it's critical that we're supporting America's Stamp Club, the American Philatelic Society, and the American Philatelic Research Library, and all the wonderment and paradise that's down there in Belfont that's no longer on Nassau Street. You've got paradise in Belfont. Thank you very, very much for your attention.